Thank you. My name is Francis. I join you from the dwellings. We are continuing our series on the ties that bind. That is, we are investigating the various kinds of social relationships that we enjoy that can enable us to pursue a life of second chances and rehabilitation. Today's topic is the complementary halves, or wholes, that make a bond life-giving, as opposed to the competing parts that make life death-dealing. So in this conference, we are going to consider the kinds of exchanges by which we can be empowered or entrapped in our futures. All life is exchange on every level. The air we breathe or the blood that pumps through our arteries are involved in exchange. Some blood cells have a lot of oxygen in them, and they exchange that oxygen for carbon dioxide from other cells, and that kind of respiration gives us life. The sexual bond is an exchange of genetic material from father and mother, whereby a new life is created. Social bonds that we exercise verbally are exchanges of language, of speech acts. So something from the tip of my tongue to the inner ear of my audience accomplishes that exchange, but really it's an exchange of mind to mind or heart to heart. Our economic life is a series of exchanges, goods and services and wages and prices. The media, the academy, our businesses are all involved in exchanges. Everything we do is a give and take. And that give and take can be healthy and grace-filled, or it can be deadly, or it can be many strange mixtures of them. But one of the, I think, most instructive things we can consider about the exchanges of our lives is that we should keep in mind that mostly exchanges have to do with one party seeing in the other something that it doesn't have, and vice versa, the other party seeing in the first something that it needs. And so when we recognize the otherness of the gift that we want, then we are likely to want to join in some kind of alliance to obtain it. Or perhaps more profoundly and more humanly, if we recognize that we have something that someone else could benefit, to enjoy, and we have an urgency to give it to them, then there are kinds of alliances that we wish to make, bonds that we wish to forge, to make the giving of such gifts possible, to make it a patterned act of giving and receiving. The whole question then will always fall back to, how do we view the basis of life itself? How do we view that exchange? Is the exchange based upon seeing what someone else has that I have not? Because if that's what we think exchange is based on, it predicts a whole series of events which follow. Or is the exchange based upon seeing what I have that someone else can use? And if that's how I see the exchange, a whole series of behaviors follow. Most people, however, don't think one way or the other about it. They just find themselves either viewing themselves as potential gift giver or seeing others as potential benefit taker. How we see ourselves, though, ought to be something examined. I think it was Socrates who said a long, long time ago that the unexamined life is not worth living. We have to get behind our exchanges and determine what has been motivating us actually all along, what primary motivation has been ordering the general exchanges of our day-to-day or decade-to-decade life. And that's the kind of thing we hope to do by these kinds of conferences, step behind and to analyze. Because perhaps we are being motivated by motives which, when made conscious, when made explicit, we might want to test or challenge or change. Perhaps we ought to make it explicit so that we can morally investigate the advisability of maintaining such a motivation in the longer run. I would like to consider with you three kinds of exchanges. These three kinds of exchanges are virtually proven by anthropologists, by cultural historians, to pretty much exhaust human behavior in all cultures and in all times. So every behavior we have which involves an exchange is one of these three. I start with the darkest one, that is called negative reciprocity. Negative reciprocity is that kind of exchange where one hopes to take more than one gives. One hopes to drive a bargain which impoverishes one's business colleague. One hopes to steal. It's a kind of theft. It can be as rude as an act of violence with a gun in a dark alley, or it can be done by lawyers with a judge and a jury before you. But negative reciprocity is the desire to get the best deal possible for oneself, regardless of the consequence to the other. I'm thinking in particular of an example of negative reciprocity which would be known to many people in my audience, but a kind of example that would be known to everybody. So I dine daily in a dining room, and in that dining room are so many dozens and dozens of glasses and cups and bowls and plates. They are there for the taking, if you will. In the cafeteria line, you stack them up and you get your food on them. At the end of the meal, you might, however, want to take a glass of something back to your small house. You might want to take a plate of some extra food for a snack in the evening. There are no guards, no one's watching. You can take the various utensils and you can take the various vessels with you. The presumption, of course, is that you would bring them back when you are done the next day. But over the course of just a couple of months of operating that dining room, hundreds of cups are missing. And they have to be purchased in great bulk again. And then dozens of the next bulk are gone. That's really rather disturbing. How many people actually have half a dozen or more stacked up in their little sink? How many people have just forgotten that they have them? Every person in particular doesn't think much about it, because after all, what could 1 or 2 cups matter? Except that if there are 100 people taking 1 or 2 cups, pretty soon the entire bulk of the vessels in the dining room are gone. Negative reciprocity, it has consequences. Those who do it, and most of us are guilty of doing it from time to time, hardly ever see themselves as culprits in any way. It's always very easy to explain why it is we lift something out of its original context and it travels with us back to our home. I assume the people in the office do this all the time with pens and paper and whatnot, that it just gets spirited away. What could it matter that dozens and dozens of employees take at will everything they can get their hands on? But of course, if you're the owner of the business and you're operating at a relatively narrow margin of success and profit, that could break the bank. And many people could end up losing their job. And I could even imagine, by some scenario, in a delicately balanced 501c3, that many people could ultimately lose their tiny home if negative reciprocity was the motivation that governed day-to-day activity. Negative reciprocity does govern many people's day-to-day activity when they live in large institutions. Because large institutions are, after all, impersonal. Large institutions don't have feelings. Doesn't seem that anything that one person can do can ultimately affect the stability or the workability or the functionality of large institutions. So people feel relatively free. I think bank robbers on the way to the bank think, I'm not really hurting anyone. It's a large bank with lots of branches. This little bit of money that I take is probably insured anyways. No one's hurt, and I'm in need. You might even think to yourself as you're taking the money out of the bank that you're like Robin Hood. You're readdressing some kind of imbalance. You're doing some kind of mysterious work of justice by grasping what you need that that large, mean-spirited institution had somehow kept from you. Yes, I think bank robbers don't feel too guilty in the midst of their act of theft. It's everyone else who sees them who knows that they should feel guilty. Negative reciprocity is something which is regularly rationalized by the many who do it. but it is done to the great detriment of humanity all the time, and to the great, I think, darkness of our moral lives, and to the collapse of many possible good institutions. Negative reciprocity operates best, or I should say, operates most effectively on the largest scale of humanity. On the scale of humanity which is the least personal and the least interpersonal. When we live on a smaller scale, we are less likely to be thieves. We are more likely to take into account the consequences of what we take and why we take it. But in the 21st century, most of humanity lives most of the time on the largest possible scale, utterly ripped from the context as young as possible of our immediate families scattered and dispersed over the largest possible areas. Now people are electronically connected to strangers all over the world. And the stranger they are to us, the less moral compulsion we have to be fair to them. Justice often lays close to loyalty. But when there is no interpersonal loyalty, justice is on the chopping block of sacrifice. Negative reciprocity is exercised in a spirit of anonymity. The more anonymity there is, the greater the likelihood of theft. You know, the proverbial idea that when no one is looking and you can get into that theater and see the $10 film that otherwise you'd have to pay for, you think to yourself, who did I rob? Who did I take? I'm just opening my eye in a dark theater. Anonymity in the darkness is the beginning of theft. The light of someone else's eyes upon us, especially someone we know, quickens a conscience, makes us think twice and regard the possibility of the pain we are causing to others by our thievery. The second kind of reciprocity is balanced reciprocity. With balanced reciprocity, there's an attempt to give more or less something of as much value as what we take. Now, there would be very little value in exchanging exactly the same things. I knew of a young man and his sister who, when they were quite young, had a birthday card that they circulated back and forth every year. She gave him a card with $5 in it. That's how old I am. When $5 used to be a birthday gift. And he held that $5 bill and that card. And several months later, when it was her birthday, he gave it back to her, the same $5 bill, the same card. That really only could work between a brother and a sister, as it were, tongue-in-cheek, smiling. It's a little joke almost. Because what good is it to give exactly the same thing that you get? No, mostly exchanges are different than that. You give something that the other doesn't have to get something that you don't have. Complementary halves. When someone has what you don't and you have what they don't, that makes for a balanced exchange. If both of you agree in the giving and the taking of that which is somewhat different, you can have a relationship built on that kind of reciprocity. Now, in the last several thousand years, the human race has invented something that facilitates balanced reciprocity quite well. Didn't exist only a few thousand years ago. And now we can't imagine it. We can't imagine society without it. Money. Currency. Nobody ever has all the currency in the world. They could always take a little bit more. I remember, I think it was in the cartoon The Simpsons, Mr. Burns, the ridiculously wealthy plutocrat, who is typically portrayed in the cartoon as endlessly animated by greed. At one point he says to his assistant Smithers, I'd give it all up, everything I have, for just a little bit more. Currency is like that. No matter how much one has or doesn't have, it facilitates an exchange. And there are agreed upon prices by which we can surrender what someone wants to purchase, and there are agreed upon prices that we can pay what they are asking. And by the lubricant of currency, we can facilitate balanced exchanges all of our lives. Fantastic to consider that until the last several thousand years, all exchanges were based upon some form of barter. You actually had to figure out how many bushels of wheat were worth how many boxes of wood. And you could try to add various kinds of extras into the exchange. But you had to balance it. If the exchange was with a stranger or someone from a great distance and someone unrelated, then you had to find some kind of measure that both of you could agree upon. Now, balanced reciprocity is something that we understand very well on a practical level because we have set prices and set wages. We know how to negotiate that world. But if you went to a bazaar, a souk in Fez, Morocco, or in Cairo, and you actually had to bargain for a price, and it wasn't set at all, and you had to argue, the old-fashioned verb to dicker, it's kind of mind-blowing for the Westerner. You're not sure whether they're trying to rip you off. They're not sure whether you're trying to rip them off. The argument goes on. It's quite wild. Believe me, if you're an American and you're in an Arab capital, you are not going to rip them off. They have done this all their lives. You are going to fail. But it's still an interesting expedition in multicultural study to try and involve yourself in that kind of exchange process. But it appears to be balanced because there can be argument, there can be debate. One can show the pros and cons of the article you are trying to purchase or the amount of money you're trying to pay. Balanced reciprocity runs two possible risks. When one or the other of the partners in this kind of exchange is nefarious, when one or the other has motives which are unworthy, balanced reciprocity tends to spiral downward to negative reciprocity. It tends to become theft. But it has the opposite possibility as well. When both of the partners in the exchange are well-meaning and well-intended, and if both of them enjoy the exchange as the game it can be, and the pleasure of almost familiar discourse it can become, when they enjoy the lively argument, and they're smiling at each other as they appreciate the skills of the other, then it spirals upward. It tends to become something almost like gift-giving and affirmation. One of the liveliest economies in the world, the Japanese economy, has a great deal of balanced reciprocity between businessmen, a very high rank, dealing in multi-million-dollar contracts, even billion-dollar contracts. And by and large, the Japanese businessman is famous for enjoying it. They like to meet at a sushi bar and then go to karaoke together afterwards. And they, for what it's worth, morally or immorally, they like to get drunk together. And it goes on hours and hours, and they're exchanging photo albums of their kids by the time they're done. And they become awfully intimate to each other in terms of telling them their life secrets. And pretty soon they agree on a deal. And you have to wonder, was it the deal that all this was about? Or was the deal a kind of game, that they could become friends, that they could become familiars? If you're the wife of one of those businessmen, that's what you think, that your husband is somehow being unfaithful by enjoying his business more than his family. But if you're of another ethnicity and that's not how business is done, you think the Japanese businessman is simply being shrewd and pretending to make familiarity the goal of the contract. Balanced reciprocity can become an act of theft or an act of friendship. You don't know which way it's going to go because you don't know, in the abstract, the mentality of the partners involved in this kind of exchange. The third kind of exchange is called diffused reciprocity. Diffused reciprocity is, as the name suggests, a mentality whereby someone is simply giving away whatever he has, whatever she possesses, giving it away regularly and often, without calculus, without measure, without a ledger, without taking stock. The only exchanges left like this in our cultural experience are the intimately familial ones. We don't expect that a mother nursing her baby is at the same time writing on a ledger how long she spent nursing the child and making a bill, so that when the child turns 18, she can say to the child, I nursed you 3,411 times. That was about 780 gallons of milk. That will cost you, given compounded interest, $780,000. Nobody does that. Well, not yet. Not yet. But in fact, if parents did that in general, if they added the hours of labor put into the aggravation of raising the child, then all of those hours subtracted from the hours they could have been working to make money, plus all the money they actually had to spend on the child to raise that child from birth, from conception to 18 or 21, and let's face it, long after. If they made an itemized bill of all of that, it would go into the millions. I've heard it said very often that having a child is like having a built-in retirement plan. Well, good luck with that. But even if the child took care of the parents 70 years after the child was born, or 80, even if the child was solicitous to the parents' welfare, in great likelihood, there is no amount of service the child can do his parent that would begin to match the endless loss of resources the parent dumped into the child for decades, not to mention the emotional costs. So if that's a retirement program, I could think of putting all of those revenues into a IRA, not have the child at all, and you'll have a lot better retirement when you're 80 years old. Diffused reciprocity is diffused. It doesn't calculate. It just gives. It only works when there's significant trust. And as I said, in our society, that only exists now between parent and child and doesn't always exist there. It used to exist until quite recently between husband and wife. But the increase in prenuptial agreements indicate it's not working there all the time either. A prenuptial agreement is exactly that, a calculus. So that just in case the other one is actually animated by negative reciprocity interests, or we're not sure the other one will be faithful to the diffused reciprocity, or even to the balanced reciprocity, but might slip into the negative, then let's make an agreement, let's make a contract. But once that contract is made, of course, it casts a shadow over everything else that follows. It cannot be that there's really the trust necessary. Diffused reciprocity means gift-giving. And it trusts that the other will also be gift-giving, without making demands, without assurances, without promises, without guarantees, without condition, without control, without manipulation. Just, I'm going to give everything, and I'm believing that sooner or later what I need is going to get back to me. It's very diffused. It might mean not just my spouse and my children, but the world, my life. I'm going to be genuinely generous as much as I can be, and maybe I'll starve to death, but I'd rather starve to death doing that than get fat living in the darkness of greed. Diffused reciprocity is that mentality of exchange which works the smallest social levels. If you have a friend with whom you are diffusedly reciprocal, You are quite lucky indeed. I remember in college, in my particular dormitory, there was something of a diffused reciprocity, of all places, in the dormitories because people left their doors open. And there was diffused reciprocity in the bathrooms and shower rooms because people left their toiletries right there. They didn't take them back and forth to their room. Anyone who wanted to use your toiletries, your shampoo, could do so. They wanted to brush their teeth with your toothpaste, have at it. If they wanted to brush their teeth with your toothbrush, what is that about? Anyways, they had the toothpaste, they had the shampoo, it was all there. It was a good way of life. And for months, we were happy in that setting. Diffuse reciprocity means you can go in and out of anyone else's room and take their books and study from them and then put them back. You trusted nobody would take anything from you. Everything would be easy, and there would be a consideration and a solicitude that this would not become somehow taking advantage of another. But then one day, it happened that somebody's shampoo was gone altogether. The whole bottle very quickly just emptied. And that made a little bit of anxiety. This was back in the days when the musical Hair was raging, and so shampoo was a big deal. And then, a few days after that, someone else's shampoo seemed to be disappearing too quickly. And so people began to take their shampoo bottles out of the showers and put them in the drawers of their dormitory room. And then it was heard that somebody's shampoo was missing from their drawer of their bedroom. And pretty soon the doors began to lock. That little Eden, if you will, of diffused reciprocity was drying up. And then somebody had the bright idea, or bad idea, was to take a bottle of good shampoo. And that day, I think it was called Vidal Sassoon. It was like the costly shampoo of the era. Someone took a bottle of Vidal Sassoon shampoo and emptied it out entirely and put instead within the bottle a product called Nair. Nair was a hair dilapidary. It was designed to remove hair from your body. You understand where this is going to go. After a few days, one of our classmates appeared with a tassel cap on his head and wouldn't take it off. And we discovered who was the thief. We said nothing. He was punished for his crime by the loss of his otherwise previous fantastic head of hair. We kind of guessed it might be he anyways. Nobody had so much hair as this one, who could use so much shampoo as this one. But after that, the shampoo came back onto the shelves, the doors remained open, the locks remained unlocked, Eden was restored. Diffused reciprocity is a fragile thing. If trust is lost, the doors lock, and people become balanced or they become negative in the exercise of their giving and their taking. Smaller scale societies all over the world are able to maintain diffused reciprocity as the ordinary means of giving and taking. Amongst their own, there's diffused. If they have exchanges with outside groups, neighboring groups, they have balanced reciprocity. If there's a group with whom they're warring against, they have negative reciprocity. They're thieves and raiders. But their allies nearby, they balance. But their friends at home, they diffuse, gift. I think of the feast called the potlatch, which is exercised by Native American Indians in traditional times in the Northwest. The potlatch is a feast which is held regularly, and in the feast, the host spends annual incomes, whole annual incomes, on feasting all his neighbors, empties all his savings, all the furs he's collected, all the food he's saved, all the shells he's jeweled into various kinds of necklaces, everything he's worked on, his family has accumulated, it's all gone in a night or a week of feasts. And at the end of that week, he has nothing. His family has nothing but the supreme goodwill of everyone with whom they live. And he's spoken of, that family is spoken of, with great admiration. And they don't starve and they don't freeze in the winter because that much admiration means everyone's taking care of them. And anyways, a few months later, somebody competes with a bigger feast. And pretty soon they're getting back stuff that they need to survive. That's diffused reciprocity, a society of continual feasting. We have a little bit of that when fathers and mothers spend everything of an annual or several annual incomes on a wedding. Diffused reciprocity is a wonderful way to live, quite humane, but almost unheard of in our time. The trouble is this. For human beings to be fulfilled as human beings, to be happy in their humanity, there must be some significant degree of diffused reciprocity. Without it, we sink into depression, anxiety, and into a kind of darkness, a moral darkness. We are born and bred to it. I don't know how many thousands of generations of humanity have accustomed themselves to diffused reciprocity as the great energy of life, the great joy of living. But without it, if life is calculus or fear of theft, without it, we are progressively dehumanized. One of the reasons why people need second chances in their lives is because negative reciprocity has impoverished them and balanced reciprocity has failed them. And without some kind of immersion into a trustworthy environment where giving and taking is diffused, they may never be rehabilitated. I would like to read from an obscure passage in the book of Genesis, 6th chapter, which describes humanity just before the flood of Noah. You might remember that there was a terrible flood in the Old Testament, at the beginning of the history of the human race, and that flood was a kind of divine punishment for something that went terribly wrong in human nature. Now the passage is a bit obscure, so I'm going to try to gloss it over with you with, I think, fair enough explanations. I just read it straight through. It's 8 verses. When men began to multiply on the earth, and daughters were born to them, the sons of heaven saw how beautiful the daughters of men were. And so they said, so they took for themselves wives, as many as possible, as many as they chose. Then the Lord said, my spirit shall not remain in man forever, since he is but flesh. His days shall comprise no more than 120 years. At that time, the Nephilim, ill-begotten monsters, the Nephilim appeared on earth, as well as later, after the sons of heaven had intercourse with the daughters of men who bore them sons. They were the heroes of old, the men of renown. When the Lord saw how great was man's wickedness on earth, and how no desire that his heart conceived was ever anything but evil, he repented that he had made man on the earth, and his heart was aggrieved. So the Lord said, I will wipe out from the earth the men whom I have created, and not only the men, but also the beasts and the creeping things and the birds of the air, for I am sorry that I made them. But Noah found favor with the Lord. Extraordinary passage. It describes a descent of humanity into a dark exchange program. When man began to multiply, that is, more and more of them, what happens when there's, beyond a certain threshold, too many of us? Anonymity is what happens. When you don't know people anymore on the city streets, when no one is calling you by name, no one is waving at you, and you walk namelessly, anonymously, you're far more likely to break a moral imperative with which you had otherwise been raised and to which you had otherwise been committed. When the numbers of humanity grew to be so large that there was anonymity, then the sons of heaven saw how beautiful were the daughters of men. That is to say, people who were born to good families became covetous to own people who had been otherwise compromised, daughters of earth. When the good put their hand to covetousness, to take rather than to give, when covetousness and envy, that's what happens when there's a lot of anonymity, when covetous and envy govern the mentality of the world, then nobody's daughter is safe and everybody's family is wrecked. And that's why in this text it says, the Lord said, that's it, you're not going to live forever. Remember, Methuselah had lived 994 years. Other people around this time were living centuries, it is said, because up until that time when there was a lot of familiarity, when people knew each other, one had a chance of becoming sanctified by the discipline of life. One kept growing older and better because one learned from one's mistakes. What happens in a small college when someone gets into a big problem and one's date says to all the other girls, he's a loser? Either you grow up and you apologize and you change your tactics and spend 2 years showing them that you can do so. If you're made of the right stuff, that's what you do. Or you say, I'm going to blow this popsicle stand and go to that big anonymous university where there are 50,000 students and I can play the same card over and over again until I find victims for my greed and my covetousness and my lust. Anonymity does not teach a lesson on the moral level. Familiarity does. And so it says in the text, when people began to exercise a kind of negative reciprocity everywhere and always, God says, you know what? It's better that you don't live very long. You're only getting worse. At that time, the Nephilim appeared after the sons of heaven had intercourse with the daughters of men. That is to say, a kind of a hybrid humanity, a misbegotten, not born out of a covenant of the father and mother's love with a hope for future generations of better and better humanity, but children who became alienated from their parents and more associated with the generation of their peers. Fathers and mothers know that no matter how much good they do for their kids, what a crapshoot. The kids might have awful friends in school and everything is lost. You just don't know who they're going to associate with. Everything. In this age of anonymity, the first age of anonymity, parents discovered their kids were no longer learning from them. They were learning from their peers. And that's why it says, the Lord saw how great was the wickedness of the earth. No desire from the human heart was ever anything but evil. Negative reciprocity everywhere. He regretted he had made man. You see, man was not made for negative reciprocity. It's made for diffused gift-giving. So the Lord said, I will wipe out from the earth that race of men whom I had created and the whole world with them, except one. Noah found favor. That is to say, one guy and his family had somehow hallowed the ideal of a covenant bond, giving gifts in a diffused way. They were not saints, and this story bears it out. They just remembered how to give and to take without calculus to each other. And if somebody erred occasionally, a little nair in the bottle of shampoo, and they would learn a lesson, and life would go on. They'd return to their old ways. That's the only way. There is no other way. Humanity keeps bumping into one disastrous, apocalyptic flood after the other. The bubbles keep bursting of negative reciprocity into every stock exchange of humanity. What works is a community where people give each other second chances and give and take with a degree of familiarity which isn't calculated but generous. When we can do that, we can connect in such a life-giving fashion that we can have a future of great promise.